Hi, my name is Joe. I use they, them pronouns. I am non-binary and trans and a former lesbian. I care deeply about the lesbian community and I still hold it very close to my heart and identify with a lot of it. I'm making this video because I noticed a lot of discourse lately about whether non-binary people or someone who uses he, him pronouns should be able to claim lesbianism. This video is in no way an invitation or a response to a debate. He, him, and non-binary lesbians are valid, have always existed, and will continue to exist whether or not certain people believe that they do. My intentions are simply to educate those who are curious or confused before they are misled by exclusionists to perpetuate harm. When entering womanhood for the first time, many are led to believe that toxic femininity is a fundamental part of the experience. Toxic femininity meaning women's gender roles designed and reinforced by the cis heteropatriarchy and for its gaze. The pressure to perform heteronormative femininity can be more intense for people that come from older generations, more rural areas, or more conservative traditional communities. Many feel estranged from their womanhood when they unlearn this and begin to embrace feminism and/or their queerness. When they are assumed to be or treated as this woman they no longer relate to or identify with, it can bring up feelings that are similar to, if not literally dysphoric. They might question what about the way they express themselves caused someone to make these assumptions about them and feel the urge to adjust as to be recognized as the person that they are. That's right, dysphoria is for more than just trans people. This is because gender nonconformity is inherent to queer people when gender roles are rooted in heteronormativity. For some, trespassing the barriers of toxic femininity can lead them to explore and discover deeper truths about their gender. It did for me. Some are able to heal and embrace a womanhood defined by their individual experience of it. Others might wrongly assume the answer is to transition to another gender instead of out of toxic femininity, which is the case for many who detransition. There is no shame in this. Gender is a spectrum and therefore can be confusing in a world that makes it so. Experimentation is a healthy and normal part of figuring out who we are. People who detransition do not invalidate trans people's very real experiences. But what about queer people who don't fall into this binary of woman or not? Who feel like their womanhood can coexist with or is inseparable from other genders that they relate to? How do they navigate sexuality without feeling ostracized from queer women's communities that they feel are a part of their culture, oppression, and identity? At what point is the queer and trans community creating its own version of limiting gender roles that we reinforce onto each other? Where do we draw the line between inclusivity and respecting the exclusivity of claiming certain oppressions? At what point are healthy identity politics being confused with toxic essentialism? Like sexuality and gender, this is more case by case than set in stone. And I think we need to embrace that in order to avoid perpetuating lateral violence. Lateral violence occurs within marginalized groups, where members project the trauma of their oppression onto each other. Common behaviors that prevent positive change from occurring include gossiping, bullying, finger-pointing, othering, demonizing, backstabbing, and gatekeeping. Many who participate in lateral violence think that they are preserving their community and that their anger is justified. Queer rage is powerful and valid, but it's important that we don't confuse righteous anger and projected anger. He, him, and non-binary lesbians are not the enemy. The cis heteropatriarchy is. In the case of lesbians who reject the idea of he, him, and non-binary lesbians, they believe that being a woman and nothing but a woman, using she, her pronouns, and liking only people who identify the same should be a requirement of claiming lesbianism. Some lesbians believe that having a uterus is a requirement of claiming lesbianism. But those of us who aren't transphobic know that bioessentialism doesn't change the fact that trans lesbians exist, always have, and will continue to do so, whether trans exclusionary radical feminists like it or not. But what does it mean to be a woman? Is it how one is socialized? Is it a shared oppression? Is it being nurturing and soft? Is it being powerful and strong? Is it body parts? Is it a feeling? Is it femininity? Is butchness womanhood? Is there a level of masculinity that isn't womanhood anymore? Seems like everybody has a different take on it. While there are some fundamental feelings and experiences required for claiming certain queer and trans identities, we shouldn't assume that each person will have the exact same relationship with them. Trying to strictly define womanhood and reject those who don't meet the criteria has been the cause of so much violence in queer women's communities. Womanhood is so much more than a definition. It's an experience that can be felt in a variety of ways. It's easy to want to denounce experiences that we don't relate to or understand at first, especially when we feel protective of our communities because of how we've been attacked, violated, tokenized, fetishized, etc. It's a visceral, knee-jerk reaction, but we are so much better than resorting to the same logic that's used to oppress us to hurt each other. Flexibility, empathy, open-mindedness, active listening, communication, and trust are crucial parts of gracefully adapting to a constantly evolving and expanding community. We don't have to erase queer identities in order to embrace the very real diversity of the way people experience them. Gender nonconforming people can feel like womanhood is a part of who they are, not a fraction like a slice of pizza, but a core ingredient in their soup of gender. Some people experience their womanhood mainly through their sapphism. The way I like to describe gender nonconforming lesbianism is the woman in me loves the woman in others. Some lesbians might bind their chest, go by a different name, or use pronouns other than she, her, because they feel it affirms their relationship to androgyny or butchness. And they still only identify as women. She, her pronouns come with assumptions that are rooted in gender roles. Gender roles are rooted in heteronormativity. Therefore, she, her pronouns can make queer women feel dysphoric. Pronouns do not imply identity unless the individual wants them to. Just like name changes don't have to imply being trans. They can simply be a part of the way that we express our queerness. I like to call it gender decoration. The decoration doesn't change the structure of the space. I also want to point out that many queer cis men enjoy being called she, her, queen, mama, sister, etc., and no one seems to care. But when queer women like being called more masculine terms or use he, him, they, them pronouns, suddenly everyone gets extremely political. This hypocrisy exposes the underlying misogyny of this issue. I have permission from my ex to share their story as an example. T is a butch lesbian, through and through. She loves her womanhood and feels no need to identify with anything else. However, the feeling of being perceived through a heteronormative lens caused her a lot of queer dysphoria. She has a larger chest and feels uncomfortable with the feminine associations with it that are unavoidable in our society. They started going by T instead of Teresa for a similar reason. They enjoy binding and are considering a breast reduction or full top surgery. They like being called both she and they pronouns because they feel like this affirms their relationship to butchness and androgyny. Only they know their truth and what feels right for them. And it's important that as a community we trust them. And here's why. When T and I were dating, it was very obvious to everyone that they were deeply uncomfortable with themselves and reserved all the time. I would later find out that T was struggling with the fact that they were dysphoric, but torn because they felt comfortable in their identity as a butch lesbian and a woman. She felt like she had to choose, so she felt stuck and closeted. No queer person should have to feel that way within their own community. But because we frequented a progressive LGBT+ community center that showed her that she could ease her dysphoria in whatever ways she needed to and still identify with lesbianism and womanhood, T was able to blossom into confidence. Isn't that what we as a community should want for each other? I have been questioned by many as to why I don't just call myself a trans man if I'm using testosterone, getting top surgery, and enjoy traditionally masculine descriptors and clothing. I often refer to myself passively as a boy, and don't mind if I get heed from time to time. Why? because it affirms my trans masculinity, which to me does not equate to manhood. My gender is a complex painting with so many colors. There may be a lot of blue, but that doesn't change the fact that there's still pink and many other colors that I can't even describe because language is so gendered. I'm the big picture, but I'm still everything that makes up my big picture. Now, when I compare T in my stories, am I implying that trans people's dysphoria is just a reaction to the infliction of gender roles, like it can be for some cis queer people? Am I implying trans people wouldn't exist in a world without gender roles? Absolutely not. Regardless, this is an irrelevant hypothetical because this world will likely never exist. But our experiences with dysphoria can intersect. Dysphoria can be triggered by a variety of factors, social, physical, or otherwise. It also doesn't have to be related to gender whatsoever. Some people feel dysphoric when they're seen or treated as someone they're not. This can be sexuality and gender related. Some experience a combination of both, and dysphorias that I am not describing in this video. Dysphoria intensity, like everything else, is a spectrum. The ways it can impact us are both immeasurable and unpredictable. Some people experience phantom body parts, which can cause difficulty urinating, reaching orgasm, or performing other related bodily functions. Some dysphoria is so intense it impacts every aspect of a person's life and causes extreme claustrophobia, anxiety, and discomfort. Some people's dysphoria is very light, or they relate to their gender identity, expression, descriptors, labels, etc., through the euphoria that they bring instead. All of these experiences are valid and not limited to trans people, although it's more common for them. Some lesbians feel as though more inclusive modern queer theory disrespects queer elders by diluting their history and trauma, because cis lesbians who use she/her pronouns are more represented in lesbian history. However, if you look back at records of lesbians before gender nonconforming experiences were more widely represented and understood, you'll find that diverse expressions of gender were common, at least in spaces where they felt safe to do so. And no, not just pre-1950, as I've heard some people claim. Throughout time, lesbians have enjoyed dressing up in drag as men, binding their chest, and going by different names and pronouns. Some were even stealth in public to avoid suspicion while courting women. Who's to say some of them didn't enjoy it? Or did it because they felt dysphoric? While there are some records of lesbians expressing dysphoria or trans identity, read Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Steinberg. Read Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Steinberg. I think it's safe to say that there were probably many lesbians in the past with similar experiences who didn't have the language, representation, or education to understand gender beyond the binary, or the freedom to explore it. They probably also weren't as represented or supported as he, him, and non-binary lesbians today. Who are we to tell these pioneers of our movement whether they earned the right to the word lesbian, when the woman in them loving the woman in others is what really matters here? Who are we to decide this for lesbians today? Cis lesbians who don't experience complex feelings about their gender or dysphoria. Who are you to try to define other people's dysphoria in relationship to womanhood? I'm not making this video in an attempt to erase or dilute the lesbian identity or its rich, powerful history in our community. I'm here because I want to protect and honor not just some of it, but all of it. I've heard people claim that the trans movement is shrinking the lesbian community as more and more people realize that gender and sexuality is more of a spectrum than a binary. I've also heard people say that we should erase gender-specific sexualities altogether because they believe sexuality and gender are fluid, and to say otherwise is transphobic and outdated. I think both of these opinions are ill-informed and harmful. I believe the lesbian community can flourish if we embrace womanhood in all its forms. There will always be people who try to claim lesbian experience for clout, to fetishize, to gain access to spaces and resources, and that's terrible. But we cannot claim that we know who these people are based on our perception of their gender and attraction. This only encourages paranoia and can hurt people who, more likely than not, are not lying about their sapphic experiences. This community is supposed to be a refuge for people whose sexualities and genders are persecuted because others don't understand them. Let's have more trust and compassion for each other and keep it that way.